I really don't like working with plywood that much, but I don't have a choice with this Murphy bed. The bed frame itself, the part that actually holds the mattress, the sides have to be made from plywood. The instructions stress that really intentionally because solid wood wouldn't have the structural strength to support the pivot joint. But plywood's kind of a pain in the neck because you either have to band it with some kind of solid banding or you have to use that iron-on tape. I made this router template because these sides have to be radiused, and that means I can't use a solid banding. I've got to use iron-on these radius edges. And I hate iron-on tape. At least I used to. There's a new self-adhesive edge banding out from FastCap, and I want to show you the difference between the two as soon as I cut these radius edges. I could cut these radiuses with a jigsaw, but I wouldn't get a really clean square cut. I'd much rather use a router, and that's why I made this router template. But I will take my jigsaw and I'll rough cut this just to get rid of some of the waste. The template has to be on the bottom beneath the workpiece so the bearing guide on the router can follow it. And I just have to make sure it's perfectly flush with the sides and the end. There we go. And I'll clamp the whole thing down. And here's the router bit. I've got a bearing guided spiral cutter here, and it's going to follow that pattern real easily. And while I've got that router template still clamped to the bottom here, I'm going to sand this because it's much easier to hold my sanding block square to the plywood when I have both pieces together. And just fair that curve around. And keep it really clean so it's easy to apply the self-adhesive edge banding. Now I've got the right hand rail and I've got the left hand rail. They're marked and I'm ready to put the edge banding on. I've got the bed rail clamped down temporarily so it's real easy to work on in a vertical position. And now I've got a piece of the old style edge banding here. You heat it up with an iron, just a regular household iron. That's why they call it iron-on edge banding. So I'm just going to place that on here and make sure that that edge banding is long enough to reach all the way to the end of the rail. You don't want to have to end up putting a joint in it and then get that hot with the iron. And you have to be careful here. If you leave that iron on there too long, you'll burn that edge banding. So keep the iron moving, but you have to get it hot enough to melt that adhesive. Oh, be careful. You can see I'm starting to burn the edge banding right in here. This is something you don't have to worry about when you use the self-adhesive. Come around that radius real gently to keep it hot. And keep that edge banding straight too. And then I can work my way down the bed rail. So once you've got it all ironed on, now you can trim it off. I've got an old Veritex trimmer here. I've used it for years. It only cuts in one direction. So be careful. It's got little arrows on it to tell you which direction to go in. And be careful when you get up to the curve here, ride that curve carefully. You don't want to strip it right off. If you come straight through here, you'll bust it right off. So ride that curve really carefully. All you have to do is squeeze this as you're cutting. Now, if your wife won't let you borrow her iron, don't worry about it. It's much easier to to use the self-adhesive. And Fast Cap has made this double easy by supplying all the tools and accessories you need to make this super easy. All you have to do is pull out your strip, and it comes in a box like this, a really easy to use dispenser. I'm going to pull out a piece that's long enough to reach all the way to the end. So you're going to notice when you pull this out of the dispenser that it's kind of curled. Obviously, it's in a roll inside of the dispenser, and the curl is actually in the wrong direction. I'm going to want to turn this around so that the adhesive is touching the workpiece, and then I'm going to want to bend it so it goes around this radius. Before I do that, though, and for anything that's straight for sure, you want to take the edge banding and just give a little pressure to it and stretch on it just a hair. And you can actually take the curl right out of it and straighten it out. You got to do that before you try to apply it, even to anything straight like this. Notice how it's now lying here pretty straight. I'm going to keep going with this a little bit more because I'm going to actually bend it in the opposite direction like this around that radius. Since it's self-adhesive, all I have to do is pull the release paper off the back. Now I've already sanded this and cleaned it really nicely with like 120, and then I took it to 220 just to make sure there was nothing left on it. And I want to make sure that none of that sawdust gets onto the back of this adhesive. So I'm going to apply this very carefully right down the edge and let it hang over the side just a little bit. And then I'll pull the release paper off the back of it and keep it straight, centered, right on the edge of the workpiece. This is pretty easy to do. Might be scary at first, but if you just pull that paper off slowly, you can actually keep this centered very easily. I'm going to trim off both ends. This is Fast Cap's edge trimmer, and I'll use it on the front too. And now I can use Fast Cap's speed roller to make sure that this adhesive sticks really good to the substrate. Now remember, this is a pressure sensitive adhesive, so it's not going to stick unless really good pressure is applied to the top of the surface. And I mean consistent pressure. Pressure like you can't get with your fingertips. That's why you want to use a roller. It has a pair of rollers, which is great on flat work, but on radius work like this, I'm just going to put that one roller on there. And now I'm going to switch tools again, and I'm going to use Fast Cap's edge trimmer. It's different than the Veritex one. This one actually can trim in both directions, but with this wood grain edge banding, you actually only want to do one side at a time because you don't want to cut into the grain. You only want to cut with the grain. So I'm going to just use one side. I'm going to put it on the side right here of the bed frame and just slide it along here. And if you do this properly, you'll get a nice clean cut right off the side. Now I'm going to go really slow around this radius here. All that's left to do is to sand down that edge a little bit and flush it out and kind of knock it down a little bit. And that's why Fast Cap calls this handy little tool a fast break, because all it does is break the edges with sandpaper. And it does it at a really nice angle too, so that nothing can ever grab the edge of this edge banding and lift it off. I can go right around this radius with the fast break too. It's easy for me to feel that this edge banding is just a little bit proud of the sheet of plywood. Maybe a 1/16th, maybe a 32nd of an inch in some places. So here's a little router with a laminate trimming bit on it, you know, a little bearing guided trimmer. And the problem with this is you got to hold that router tight against the edge banding, and it's got to be perfectly plumb, perfectly square to the edge banding. If you rock the router even a tiny bit, you might dig right into the plywood veneer, or you'll cut that edge banding at a slight bevel or something, and you don't want that either. You want that joint to be perfectly flat. You can do it with this router, but it ain't easy. There's a much easier way. These days, I've been using an MFK for trimming edge banding, and this thing works awesome, but you gotta set it up. It's not really designed to trim a 1/4 inch edge banding like this. You can see I took the laminate trimmer base that came with the router and I bored out a really long hole here so I could get my bit in. This tool isn't designed to really put a laminate trimming bit like this in there with the bearing on it, but I really wanted to use the bearing, and this base allows me to adjust the depth of the cut too, so I have 2 ways of controlling the cut. This adjustment knob right here, I can change the depth of cut between the bearing and the base on this little laminate trimmer. So as I tighten this up, you can see the gap changing right in here, and I'm actually bringing the base down from the cutter and exposing more of the cutter and more of the bearing. Or I can go in the opposite direction with that adjustment knob and bring the base up until it's almost perfectly flush with the bearing. And that's what I want. I want the base right here to be flush with the bearing on this cutter. And that way, when I put the router down on the workpiece, I've got all of this support that's sitting on the plywood, and the back end of the router will never rock down. It'll never tip in either direction. This is one of the safest ways I've found for cutting solid edge banding. This big bearing right here, it's adjustable too with this knob, and it controls the depth of cut, how far the bit actually projects over the plywood, and where that little bearing on the bit rides on the plywood. Let me remove the base on the MFK here for a second, and I'll show you how I've adjusted this bearing for the depth of cut. You can see that the bearing is riding on the edge banding, not on the plywood. So I want to adjust the big bearing on the MFK and just take it back a little bit so I get the full cutter onto the 1/4 inch edge banding, and the small bearing is riding on the plywood. I'll tighten that down, and now I'm ready to make a cut. There we go. That's really close to flush. All I have to do is sand this off lightly and it'll be perfectly flush. Now I'm using 150 grit sandpaper here. I do not want to go through the veneer and ruin this sheet. But you'll also notice that I've been keeping the body of the sander, almost all of it, right on the sheet. That's because if I held it out here, the sander might have a tendency to tip a little bit and I wouldn't even be aware of it. I've done this too many times. Make sure you hold the sander with at least 3/4 of it sitting on the plywood, and that way you won't end up with a bevel or a chamfer right on your edge.